Yeah, if I can, CaPRI, I just want to commend you on this. I think it's an excellent start. I believe that there's a lot more that needs to be done because I think a lot of the conclusions in terms of what needs to be done are rather on the surface and more analysis needs to be done. I believe that if you look at the chart in terms of the debt to GDP, everything was going great up until FinSAC. And then that was the change. What has changed? The issue which I think we need to explore is more than just a debt to GDP relationship. There's something behind that. What happened, if you look at the growth that happens, right? When FinSAC came, what happened is that it killed the productive sector. So therefore, we started having growth in terms of revenue and certainly inflation because people are paying high interest rates on paper. And therefore, we developed a cash plus type economy, right? Where the first person who got in would always be paid more and you had to borrow more to pay that person because there's no productive base to drive that. So if you look, for example, at the GDP component, which I think is important, from 2000, 2001, our growth, although we're seeing higher growth than the late 90s, the growth was because of things like construction, financial services, the distributive trade, right? So as we get that growth happening, what are we doing at the same time? We're also eroding the balance of payments. And that places greater pressure on inflation and the exchange rate. And in order to control that, we have to borrow again. So the real problem is that we don't have a proper productive base. If you look at growth, in 45 years since independence, Jamaica has grown and accumulated 97%. 69% of that growth was 1962 to 1971 because you had a productive base. So I would just implore you to look a lot deeper into those numbers. I agree with my friend there that the problem with government is not the size, but productivity, which if we see from the 1970s until now has been declining every single year.
The ratio of teachers to students is not acceptable. And also, we actually have 50% less police officers than we actually need. So clearly there needs to be a rebalancing. However, I want us to look at the fact that while we need some rebalancing, in Jamaica, you mentioned that in the UK, the government was 52% of GDP, of the expenditure in the economy. In Jamaica, I believe it's something like 70%. That's time to be corrected. And I know it changes from year to year, but roughly 70%. That's very high. Now, what ends up happening, in my view, is that when the government keeps spending more than it has, it's hard to control the deficit. It's also hard to control corruption, which was not considered in the presentation. And when you have the corruption with the extra spending more than you need, is that you have to borrow. And of course, we all know that when you borrow, the interest expense on the budget rises. And when the interest expense on the budget rises, you have to tax the people more in order to pay for the increased interest expense on the budget. And of course, the increase in taxes means that there's less disposable income to go around to expand the private sector. So we must recognize that we have to improve our productivity. Productivity in the private sector is critical. And then we have to ask ourselves, okay, if we have to improve productivity in the private sector, how is the best way to do that? You have to reduce taxes. I mean, not necessarily overall tax collection, but tax rates to the individual businesses. So you can improve your tax efficiency and the individual business actually pays less tax. And you have to look to reduce interest rates at some point. And it's the crowding out effect that I think CaPRI alluded to earlier. So I just want us to look at that as a possibility, that we have to, if government has to be large, it must at least be efficient.
Right, I totally agree with the gentleman as it relates to the large government. If a large government equals growth, then a large government is what we need. But if a large government is all about padding, then that is where we have a problem. Much has been said as it relates to FinSAC and all, but in order for us to get out of this situation as it relates to why we saw Bruk, We have to change some bad habits that exist in society. We're talking about corruption, somebody just mentioned it, overspending, the inability to collect taxes, too much is being spent on debt, and even crime and violence. All of these are contributing factors to why we're in such a predicament. As it relates to the crime and violence issue, we're talking about behavior modification, right? So in order for us to address that issue, we have to think of changing the behavior of the persons in which contribute to such. I am one who believes in probably increased taxes to some extent. Let me tell you why. In most first world countries that I've been to, they pay for almost every single thing. That is how the country is operated, by taxes. Let's say we cannot afford it. Is it a case where we are not collecting the taxes, or we are not capable of? Because there are many organizations, we hear about it all the time, not paying their taxes, not paying their taxes. We need to ensure that these institutions, these organizations, these private sector entities pay their taxes, because that is in fact how the country operates. We can only come up with a budget from the income of the country, right? And it is from these taxes that we have resources, financial resources to spend. So though it is probably not an easy pill to swallow, taxes are extremely important, and we need to look at that issue.